December 13th, 1943. Dawn breaks cold over an 8th Air Force base in England. The sound of engines warming up shatters the morning quiet as ground crews make final preparations. A B-24 Liberator heavy bomber, 27,000 pounds of riveted aluminum and ordnance, roars down the runway, bound for Kiel, Germany. The mission: strike Nazi U-boat facilities that have been wreaking havoc on Allied shipping convoys. Inside the lead aircraft's cockpit sits the pilot commanding the high squadron formation. His hands are steady on the controls. His focus is absolute. Just months earlier, those same hands had signed autographs outside Hollywood premieres. The face behind the oxygen mask had graced movie posters across America. Jimmy Stewart. The earnest everyman from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and the Philadelphia Story. Now, he's piloting a bomber into German airspace where fighters and flak batteries wait to tear his aircraft apart. But here's the thing that makes this story even more remarkable. The military didn't want him. When Stewart was drafted in 1940, doctors took one look at his lanky frame and rejected him. Underweight, 5 pounds below the minimum requirement. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. A legitimate way to stay home, stay safe, keep making movies and money. Stewart refused to accept it. He spent a month working with a trainer, forcing himself to eat massive meals, anything to put on weight. When he showed up for re-examination, he'd barely added a few pounds, still under the minimum. But Stewart had another card to play: his pilot's license, secured in 1935, and over 400 hours of flight time. The Army Air Forces needed pilots desperately. Stewart leveraged that experience, essentially forcing his way into service despite his weight. Fast forward 20 years from that Kiel mission. Stewart's wearing a different uniform now, that of an Air Force Brigadier General, one star gleaming on his shoulder. He's certified to pilot B-52 Stratofortresses, massive 8-engine bombers carrying nuclear weapons, the same guy who played George Bailey, the earnest everyman dreaming of escaping Bedford Falls in It's a Wonderful Life, spent decades as a legitimate military warrior, qualified to deliver apocalyptic destruction if ordered. That's Hollywood's golden age in a nutshell. The surface story: glamorous movie stars, red carpet premieres, Oscar speeches written by studio publicists. That's what everyone remembers. That's what gets mythologized in retrospectives and documentary specials. But underneath that carefully polished surface, the real lives of these people were far more dramatic, complicated, morally ambiguous, and fascinating than anything they ever performed on screen. Hollywood's golden age wasn't just about making movies. It was about manufacturing human beings. Think about that phrase: manufacturing human beings. Studios didn't just control what films their stars appeared in. They controlled their names, pulling Marion Morrison out of obscurity and turning him into John Wayne. They controlled their backgrounds, inventing wholesome origin stories for performers who'd come from poverty or scandal. They controlled their relationships, sometimes forbidding marriages or arranging fake romances for publicity. They controlled their very identities, down to how they walked, how they talked, what they wore, who they were seen with in public. Studios employed fixers whose entire job was to make scandals disappear, to pay off witnesses, to ensure that the manufactured image never cracked. And when real human complexity collided with that manufactured perfection, when actual human beings with flaws and desires and weaknesses and sometimes extraordinary courage couldn't sustain the performance anymore, the results ranged from heroic to tragic to absolutely scandalous. Some stars transcended the system through acts of genuine valor. Others were destroyed when a single scandal shattered years of careful image building. And some spent their entire lives trapped between who they really were and who the studios had told the world they were supposed to be. The era we're talking about spans from the first sound films in 1927 through 1969, 4 decades that established the world's most influential filmmaking style and created the modern concept of celebrity. Los Angeles transformed from a quiet town into a sprawling empire of dreams and secrets. Actors became gods, studios became kingdoms, and the disconnect between Hollywood and average Americans, that existed from day one, and it came down to one thing: money. In the 1920s, the average American family earned about $3,200 a year. That figure dropped even lower during the Depression. Meanwhile, silent film heartthrob Rudolph Valentino pulled in $7,500 per week at his peak. Per week. That kind of wealth demanded display, and Hollywood's new aristocracy built monuments to their success. The most famous monument belonged to the era's ultimate power couple, the original Brangelina, decades before Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie were born, Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. Think about how massive they were in the 1920s. Pickford was known as America's sweetheart, the most recognizable female face on the planet. Fairbanks was the swashbuckling action hero, leaping across rooftops in silent films, setting the template for every action star who followed. Together, they weren't just celebrities, they were royalty. In 1919, they co-founded United Artists alongside Charlie Chaplin and director D.W. Griffith. That move alone was revolutionary, stars taking control of their own distribution, refusing to be entirely beholden to the big studios. It was a power play that signaled Hollywood had evolved from a scrappy collection of Nickelodeons into a genuine industry with moguls and empires. The following year, Pickford and Fairbanks married. The wedding made international headlines, and Fairbanks, understanding the importance of symbols, bought his bride a Beverly Hills lodge. But a simple lodge wouldn't suffice. He hired Wallace Neff, the architect who essentially created California's distinct architectural style, that blend of Spanish colonial revival and Mediterranean influences that still defines Southern California's aesthetic. Over 5 years, Neff transformed the property into something extraordinary. The estate, dubbed Pick Fair by the press in a combination of their names, grew into a 56-acre luxury sprawl that became the most famous private residence in America. The main house alone had 4 floors and 25 rooms. Every detail was carefully considered. Frescoed ceilings that would have fit comfortably in a Venetian palazzo, paneled walls imported from European estates, Far East antiquities collected from the couple's travels, Japanese screens, Chinese porcelain, artifacts that spoke of wealth and worldliness. Outside, the estate featured tennis courts where Hollywood's elite played weekend matches, servants' quarters that housed the small army required to maintain such a property, stables with thoroughbred horses, an Old West-style saloon with a mahogany bar where Fairbanks could play the cowboy he'd portrayed on screen. And then there was the swimming pool, the first private pool in Los Angeles. That detail matters more than it might seem. In an era where most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing, Pickford and Fairbanks had built a private swimming pool. It wasn't just luxury. It was a statement about the gap between Hollywood and everyone else. The couple entertained lavishly. Their parties weren't just social gatherings. They were events that shaped culture, politics, and international relations. Invitations to Pick Fair were among the most coveted items in America. Receive an invitation, and you'd joined an exclusive club that transcended mere wealth. Life magazine called Pick Fair a gathering place only slightly less important than the White House and much more fun. Consider that assessment. In the 1920s and 1930s, a movie star couple's home rivaled the seat of American government in cultural importance. Their guest list read like a who's who of the 20th century, President Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor taking time from running the country to sip cocktails with movie stars. Albert Einstein, perhaps the greatest scientific mind of the age, discussing relativity between courses at dinner. H.G. Wells, the father of science fiction. F. Scott Fitzgerald, chronicler of the Jazz Age. Thomas Edison, the inventor who'd made motion pictures technologically possible. Amelia Earhart, fresh from record-breaking flights. Even the King and Queen of Siam traveled halfway around the world to attend parties at Pick Fair. These weren't just parties. They were displays of power that signaled Hollywood had become its own nation, complete with its own royalty, its own court, its own sphere of influence that extended across the globe. Rudolph Valentino wanted that same kind of statement, that same declaration of arrival. By 1925, the Latin lover, as he was known to millions of swooning fans worldwide, had achieved a level of fame that's difficult to comprehend today. Women fainted at his appearances. Riots broke out at premieres. Valentino received thousands of marriage proposals from fans who'd never met him, proposals written in desperate, sometimes disturbing language. He needed an escape from the mania, a refuge from admirers who sometimes crossed the line into obsession. He also wanted to showcase his newfound wealth in a way that made clear he'd transcended his humble immigrant origins. So, Valentino dropped $175,000 on an estate in Benedict Canyon. To put that figure in perspective, remember that the average American family earned $3,200 per year. Valentino spent the equivalent of 55 years of average American wages on a single property. He named it Falcon Lair after his character in a 1924 hit film, The Hooded Falcon. The name itself was carefully chosen, mysterious, romantic, with just a hint of danger, very on brand. Valentino didn't just buy the property, he transformed it, molding the landscape to reflect his aesthetic and his heritage. He outfitted the estate to reflect his Italian roots, rows of Italian cypress trees standing sentinel along the drives, their dark green silhouettes creating dramatic shadows. Italian gardens with fountains and statuary imported from Europe. Stone pathways and terraces that could have been lifted from a Tuscan villa. As an accomplished horseman, one of his few talents that required no Hollywood embellishment, Valentino built stables for his 4 Arabian steeds. Those horses were themselves status symbols, expensive purebreds that spoke of wealth and taste. Most mornings, locals who lived in the canyon below could see him riding across his property, a solitary figure on horseback, overlooking what would become Beverly Hills and the famous Rodeo Drive shopping district. Even in his private moments, Valentino was performing, creating the image of the romantic figure alone with his thoughts, riding the California hills like some transplanted nobleman surveying his domain. Before we go deeper into these estates and the lives lived within them, I want to let you know what this channel is all about. We bring you real stories from history every single day, the kind of stories that reveal unexpected depths behind familiar names and challenge what you thought you knew. If you love discovering the hidden layers of history, the scandals, the heroism, the contradictions that make the past endlessly fascinating, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, what we're about to uncover will completely change how you see Hollywood's golden age. The glamour was real, but so was everything else. Quick question, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these historical stories reach. Los Angeles, London, Mumbai? Let me know. Now, those estates, Pickfair, Falcon Lair, and dozens of others, they were the visible face of Hollywood's transformation. But behind those gates, a system was taking shape that would control every aspect of performers' lives, the star system. And to understand Hollywood's golden age, you have to understand how that system worked, because it explains almost everything that happened. Here's how it functioned. Studios hired talent scouts to spot new performers with potential. These scouts haunted soda fountains, dance halls, beauty pageants, anywhere young attractive people congregated. The emphasis was on image rather than acting ability. Studios figured acting could be taught. Beauty, presence, that indefinable star quality, that's what they searched for. Once someone signed an exclusive contract, the studio took complete control. They gave performers new names, often choosing something that sounded more American, more glamorous, more marketable. Archie Leach became Cary Grant. Lucille LeSueur became Joan Crawford. Marion Morrison became John Wayne. Sometimes they even invented entirely new backgrounds, erasing ethnic or working-class origins that might not fit the image they wanted to sell. Then came the training. Voice lessons to eliminate regional accents or speech impediments. Acting lessons to teach basic craft. Dance lessons because musicals were enormously profitable. Etiquette coaching so these often working-class kids could convincingly portray aristocrats. Lessons in how to walk, how to sit, how to hold a cigarette or a cocktail glass. Everything was scrutinized, adjusted, perfected. The system worked like an apprenticeship, or maybe more accurately like an assembly line for human talent. New performers got supporting roles first, often uncredited. They'd play secretaries, waitresses, soldiers in crowd scenes. The studio would watch audience reactions, read fan mail, gauge whether someone had that spark that translated through the camera. If they showed promise, they graduated to lead roles in minor productions, B-movies, cheap westerns, forgettable programmers that filled the bottom half of double features. Do well there, consistently pull in audiences even in inferior material, and maybe you'd graduate to starring in a major production with a real budget, top-tier directors, promotional campaigns. The system created legends. Clark Gable, Joan Crawford, Cary Grant, Rock Hudson, Rita Hayworth. These weren't just talented people who happened to make it through hard work and luck. They were manufactured products, as carefully crafted and marketed as automobiles or soap brands. Gable's story illustrates the process perfectly. He got started with supporting roles in 1930, a face in the background. Then, MGM signed him in 1931 for $350 a week. Good money, but not star money. That year alone, he appeared in 8 films for MGM and 2 more on loan to Warner Brothers. 10 films in 1 year. The studio was testing him, seeing what worked, building his profile. They paired him with established female stars, Joan Crawford, who had genuine heat with Gable on screen. Greta Garbo, the studio's mysterious Swedish goddess. Norma Shearer, married to MGM's production chief Irving Thalberg. The chemistry was often electric, but MGM noticed something in Gable's performances, a particular quality that audiences responded to, so they began typecasting him. Gable was required to display savage, even sadistic attitudes toward women on screen. He'd grab them roughly, speak to them dismissively, dominate them physically and emotionally. In one film, he slapped Barbara Stanwyck so hard her head snapped to back. Audiences, particularly female audiences, loved it. That quality established a brand that made Gable a massive star. But it also trapped him in a particular kind of role, limited his range, defined his image in ways that became impossible to escape. And here's the thing, Gable had absolutely no say in the matter. As he put it in 1932, just a year into his stardom, "I have never been consulted as to what part I would like to play. I am not paid to think." Let that sink in. One of Hollywood's biggest stars, a man who would eventually become known as the King of Hollywood, and he wasn't paid to think. He was paid to show up, hit his marks, deliver his lines the way the director ordered, and embody whatever the studio had decided his image should be. Think about that for a moment. One of Hollywood's biggest stars, a man so successful he became known as the King of Hollywood, and he wasn't paid to think. The contracts these performers signed gave studios extraordinary, almost feudal levels of control. Studios owned exclusive rights to their name, image, and voice. A performer couldn't appear in any other studio's films, couldn't do radio shows, couldn't even make personal appearances without studio permission. The studio owned your face. If you wanted to use your own image for any commercial purpose, you needed to ask permission from the people who employed you. The terms got even more invasive. If an actor was hurt or disfigured in any way, a car accident, a botched medical procedure, anything that might damage their marketability, they could be suspended without compensation. The studio had invested in creating your image. If that image was damaged, you were worthless to them, and they owed you nothing. Performers had to work 40 weeks annually, basically year-round with only brief breaks. They had to perform in up to 3 movies per year, whatever roles the studio assigned, whether they wanted to do them or not. And here's the financial trap. Even someone as successful as Gable was still essentially a salaried employee. He got paid his weekly wage, whether his films made millions or bombed at the box office. The studio took all the upside. Gable didn't get a percentage share of his movie's grosses until 1946, 15 years into his career, after he'd already made MGM hundreds of millions of dollars. By that point, he'd already starred in Gone with the Wind, one of the highest-grossing films ever made. He got his weekly salary for that work. MGM kept the profits. And it got worse, particularly for women who faced additional layers of control and scrutiny. To protect their investment, because remember, studios saw performers as investments, property they'd developed and now owned. They included morality clauses in contracts. These clauses were intentionally vague, which gave studios maximum flexibility to interpret them however served their interests. Men had to appear as gentlemen at all times in public settings. No drunken scenes stumbling out of nightclubs, no brawls with photographers or other actors, no affairs with married women that might generate scandal, no behavior whatsoever that might tarnish the heroic or romantic images studios had so carefully crafted. Women faced far stricter, more invasive standards that controlled virtually every aspect of their public existence. They were never, ever to leave home without full makeup, not to run errands, not to walk their dogs, not even to check the mail. Because you never knew when a photographer might snap a picture, and a single photograph of a glamorous star looking ordinary could damage years of image building. They had to dress stylishly and expensively at all times. Studios sometimes provided wardrobes for major events, but performers were often expected to maintain their glamorous appearance at their own expense on their own time. A star might earn good money, but maintaining the lifestyle that stardom demanded could eat through those earnings. They had to behave like ladies according to 1930s standards, which meant no smoking in public where they might be photographed, no drinking to excess, no visible relationships with men who hadn't been vetted and approved by studio executives. Some studios even controlled when and whom their stars could marry. A marriage that hurt a star's image, that made her seem unavailable to male fans, or that paired her with someone the studio deemed unsuitable, could be forbidden outright. Their private lives weren't private. Everything was subject to studio oversight and control. The studios had absolute control over their performers' careers, and that power lent itself to extraordinary, sometimes shocking abuses. Those who angered their Hollywood masters by demanding better roles, by refusing assignments, by trying to exercise any autonomy whatsoever, were often punished with calculated cruelty. You'd be given deliberately unattractive or demeaning roles designed to humiliate you or damage your carefully built star image. Or you'd be loaned out to less prestigious studios, sent to make cheap programmers and B-movies that did nothing for your career while the studio collected your loan-out fee. Worst of all, you might be shelved completely, kept under contract so you couldn't work anywhere else, but given no work at all. You'd just sit at home watching your career die, knowing you were legally bound and powerless to do anything about it. Jane Greer's story illustrates just how vindictive and psychologically cruel the system could be when wielded by someone with unlimited resources and a personality disorder. Greer was a beautiful young woman, barely 20, who caught the eye of Howard Hughes. Hughes was one of Hollywood's strangest figures, a millionaire tycoon with obsessions with aviation, filmmaking, and controlling beautiful women. He had his fingers in multiple studios, owned aircraft companies, seemed to have unlimited money and unlimited arrogance. Hughes sponsored Greer's entry into Hollywood, using his connections and money to open doors that would have remained closed to her otherwise. She was talented, but talent alone wasn't enough. You needed a powerful patron. Hughes became that patron, but the price was steep. In exchange for his sponsorship, he signed Greer to a personal contract, not with a studio, which would have been normal, but with him personally, which gave him total control. And Hughes made his expectations crystal clear. He told Greer explicitly that he never wanted her to marry anyone. He wanted her available, wanted to own her in ways that went far beyond mere professional control, wanted her life to revolve around his whims and his approval. When Greer went ahead and married a singer she'd fallen in love with, exercising what most people would consider a basic human right, Hughes was enraged, not disappointed, not merely annoyed, enraged in the way only someone who sees other human beings as possessions can be enraged. So he shelved her completely. She was in her early 20s, at the age when an actress should be building her career, getting experience, establishing herself. Instead, she couldn't work for Hughes, and because he held her contract, she couldn't work for anyone else either. Greer was trapped in legal limbo, watching her career die before it had barely started, knowing that every month that passed made her less relevant, less marketable, easier to forget. She fought back, which took genuine courage. Greer sued Hughes to get out of the personal contract, taking on one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, fighting through courts for her freedom. She succeeded, finally breaking free after months of legal battles and mounting legal fees. Victory. She signed with RKO Pictures to restart her career, finally able to work, to act, to build the career she'd been promised. So, Howard Hughes bought RKO. He purchased an entire major motion picture studio, spending millions of dollars in what was essentially a personal vendetta. He bought RKO not because it was a good investment, not because he needed another studio, but because Jane Greer had defied him, and he wanted the power to continue wrecking her career. That's the level of vindictive pettiness and psychological sadism built into the system when powerful men had essentially unlimited resources. Hughes wasn't content to simply let her go, to move on to controlling some other young actress. He had to win. He had to prove that no one, especially not a woman he'd decided to sponsor, defied him without facing ongoing consequences. The fact that Hughes had the money and power and sheer vindictiveness to buy an entire studio to pursue a personal vendetta against one young actress tells you everything about the grotesque power imbalance between studios, moguls, and performers. These weren't employment relationships, they were ownership relationships, and the performers, no matter how famous or beloved by audiences, had almost no power to protect themselves. For performers trapped in this system, the pressure was immense and relentless. Studios manufactured a public image, then demanded you live that image 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. No breaks, no moments of being your authentic self in public. The disconnect between who you really were, a complicated human being with desires, frustrations, weaknesses, and who you were supposed to be, some idealized, perfect version of humanity, could tear a person apart. Some rebelled openly, accepting the professional consequences. Others tried desperately to become the image, to actually transform themselves into the impossible ideal the studio had sold to the public. A few, a very few, managed to transcend the system entirely through sheer force of will or extraordinary circumstances. But everyone felt the weight of maintaining that performance every single moment. 15-year-old Julia Jean Turner skipped school one day in 1936 to buy a Coke on Sunset Boulevard. Seems like a small thing, right? A teenager playing hooky to get a soda. But that one decision changed her life completely. Her beauty, and she was genuinely extraordinarily beautiful, caught the attention of a Hollywood reporter hanging around the soda fountain. When he asked if she'd like to become an actress, Turner gave the kind of response that speaks to how young she actually was. "I'll have to ask my mother first." Her mother, ill and broke and desperate for any opportunity to improve their circumstances, jumped at the chance. She signed her teenage daughter to a contract with Warner Brothers without much negotiation, just grateful for the opportunity. Within months, the novice actress, now renamed Lana Turner, a name the studio chose because it sounded more glamorous, more American, more marketable, was a genuine hit. Warner Brothers and later MGM, after they bought her contract, packaged and presented her as wholesome, as America's good girl, as the kind of young woman every parent wanted their daughter to be. But Turner was still a teenager, still figuring out who she was, still pushing boundaries the way teenagers do. To protect their investment in her wholesome image, MGM hired chaperones to accompany her wherever she went. Imagine that. You're 16, 17 years old. Suddenly you're famous, making more money than your family ever dreamed of. And you can't go anywhere without an adult minder watching your every move, reporting back to the studio, making sure you don't do anything that might tarnish the carefully constructed image. The restrictions eventually chafed in ways the studio executives should have predicted. Turner began to push back, testing boundaries, looking for spaces where she could be herself, rather than the character MGM had created. The result was scandal. America's favorite good girl began to party hard once she reached her 20s, developing a taste for alcohol and excitement, and most problematically for her image, bad boys. Not just Hollywood tough guy poseurs who played gangsters on screen, but were actually mild-mannered actors. Turner worked her way toward the real thing, genuine criminals and violent men. The degree of badness in her romantic choices grew steadily over the years, as if she was working her way up a ladder of danger. By the late 50s, Turner's career had passed its peak. She was still bankable, still beautiful, but no longer the fresh-faced teenager MGM had discovered. She no longer cared much about maintaining the wholesome image the studio had created. That image had become a prison, and she wanted out. Then she met Johnny Stompanato. Stompanato was a mobster with close, direct ties to Mickey Cohen, Los Angeles' key crime boss. On the surface, Stompanato had qualities that made him attractive to someone like Turner. He was a World War II Marine Corps veteran, which gave him a veneer of respectability. He was handsome, genuinely good-looking in that classic 1950s way, the kind of man who wore expensive suits and looked comfortable in nightclubs and exclusive restaurants. He knew how to charm, how to make a woman feel special and protected. But beneath that surface lived a violent psychopath who did not hesitate for a moment to beat the living daylights out of Turner, starting from the very first time she tried to break up with him. That should have been the end. One incident of violence, and a sensible person walks away forever. But Stompanato was skilled at the cycle of abuse that keeps victims trapped. Violence, followed by apologies, gifts, promises that it would never happen again, periods of tenderness that made Turner hope he could change. Then more violence, then more apologies. An endless, exhausting, soul-destroying cycle. It was a toxic relationship from day one, the kind that destroys everyone it touches. Throughout a stormy year, 365 days of psychological and physical hell, Turner and her psycho beau carried on a torrid affair filled with violent arguments that neighbors could hear through walls, physical abuse that left bruises Turner had to cover with makeup, frequent breakups where she'd swear it was over, and just as frequent reconciliations where he'd show up with flowers or jewelry and she'd take him back. Turner later claimed, and there's no reason to doubt her, that on at least one occasion, Stompanato drugged her drink when they were together. While she was passed out, unconscious and vulnerable, he photographed her naked in compromising positions. That wasn't passion or romance. That was calculated. He was creating blackmail material, insurance, to keep Turner under his control. If she tried to leave, he could threaten to release those photographs, destroying what remained of her career and reputation. In the 1950s, nude photographs of a major Hollywood star would have been devastating, career-ending. Stompanato knew exactly what he was doing. He was building a cage around her. The relationship finally ended on the evening of April 4th, 1958. That date deserves to be remembered because of what happened, because of how it exposed the rottenness beneath Hollywood's glamorous surface. Stompanato arrived at Turner's Beverly Hills home. The house was elegant, expensive, exactly what you'd expect for a movie star. But elegance doesn't protect you from violence. As was their pattern, their toxic routine, the duo began to argue almost immediately. The argument moved to the bedroom, voices raised. Turner later testified that Stompanato was enraged about something, his anger escalating in ways that terrified her. Outside the closed bedroom door, Turner's 14-year-old daughter Cheryl stood. Laura, good listening. Think about that for a moment. A 14-year-old girl, home from school, listening to her mother being threatened by a violent man. Cheryl had witnessed this cycle before. The arguments, the violence, the tears, the reconciliations. She'd seen her mother's bruises. She'd lived in a home filled with fear, never knowing when the next explosion would come. When at some point during the argument, Stompanato began making explicit threats. He was going to kill Turner. He was going to kill her daughter. He was going to kill her mother. He was going to destroy everyone she loved. Cheryl made a decision. She ran to the kitchen. Her hands were probably shaking as she opened drawers, looking for something, anything that might protect her mother. She grabbed a kitchen knife. Then she ran back to the bedroom and waited outside the door, knife in hand, a 14-year-old girl preparing to do something no child should ever have to consider. When Turner finally managed to push Stompanato out of the bedroom, trying to physically get him out of her house, Cheryl acted. She stabbed him in the stomach, one thrust. The blade went deep, cutting through clothing and skin and muscle, severing the abdominal aorta. Stompanato collapsed. Blood spread across the floor. Within minutes, he was dead. The scandal was a media sensation. Hundreds of journalists crowded into the jury inquest. After 4 hours of testimony and 25 minutes of deliberation, the jury ruled it justifiable homicide. Cheryl was made a ward of the court for over 2 weeks. A juvenile court judge expressed concern over her lack of personal parental supervision. She was eventually released to her grandmother's custody, with court-ordered psychiatric visits for both her and her parents. I have to pause here and ask you something. A 14-year-old girl killed her mother's abusive boyfriend to protect her family. The court ruled it justifiable homicide. They agreed she had no choice. But then, that same court questioned whether Lana Turner was fit to parent, whether her lifestyle had created the circumstances that put her child in that impossible position. When your choices bring violence into your home and your child has to become the protector, where's the line between victim and responsibility? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you draw that line, because this case sits right in the moral gray zone. The Turner scandal exemplified something fundamental about Hollywood's golden age. The manufactured image, wholesome, perfect, controlled, was always destined to collide with messy human reality. Sometimes that collision was private. Sometimes it played out in courtrooms with hundreds of journalists watching. But it was inevitable because you can't actually manufacture human beings. You can only create a performance, and performances eventually end. John Wayne understood that better than most, even if he spent his entire life trying to deny it. Wayne's public image, the tough guy, the quintessential American fighting man, the embodiment of virile masculinity, was carefully crafted. But it was also, in many ways, a lie that Wayne told himself as much as he told audiences. And the origin of that lie traces back to World War II, and a decision that haunted him forever. Wayne's real name was Marion Robert Morrison. Director Raoul Walsh cast him in his first lead role in The Big Trail, released in 1930. The movie flopped, sending Morrison back into obscurity. But Walsh and the studio had given him a new name, John Wayne. For the next several years, Wayne toiled through dozens of forgettable westerns for Poverty Row Studios. Then, in 1938, Oscar-winning director John Ford offered him the lead in Stagecoach. The movie was a hit, and it kicked off a 23-picture relationship between Wayne and Ford. Ford crafted Wayne's public image and transformed him into a Hollywood legend through 23 films together. But their relationship was brutal, borderline abusive in ways that would never be tolerated today. Ford had a well-documented reputation for psychological cruelty toward actors. He believed humiliation brought out authentic performances, broke down actors' defenses, forced them to reach for something real. But Ford reserved special, concentrated venom for Wayne, perhaps sensing that Wayne desperately craved his approval, which made him the perfect target for manipulation. On the set of Stagecoach, Ford seemed to dislike everything about Wayne. At one point early in filming, Ford stopped a scene, walked over, grabbed Wayne by the chin in front of the entire crew, dozens of people watching this public humiliation, and shouted at him with genuine anger and contempt. "Why are you moving your mouth so much? Don't you know that you don't act with your mouth in pictures?" Wayne, mortified, his face burning with embarrassment, tried to adjust his performance to please the director whose approval meant everything to his career. But Ford wasn't done breaking him down, wasn't satisfied with just one humiliation. Ford also hated how Wayne moved across the frame, which he thought looked soft, weak, insufficiently masculine for the tough Western hero Ford was trying to create. During one scene, Ford stopped filming again and called out loud enough for everyone on set to hear, making sure Wayne's humiliation was as public as possible. "Can't you walk? Instead of skipping like a goddamn fairy?" That insult, delivered with Ford's trademark cruelty in front of cast and crew, cut so deep that Wayne literally changed the way he walked for the rest of his life. The iconic John Wayne strut, that rolling gait that became one of his most recognizable traits, that swagger that screamed masculinity and toughness, was born from humiliation and a desperate, almost pathological need to never again be called effeminate. Wayne consciously, deliberately altered his body mechanics, practiced a new way of moving until it became second nature, all because of one cruel jab from a director whose approval he craved. For the next 40 years, every time John Wayne walked across a movie screen, he was still trying to prove to John Ford that he wasn't a fairy. By 1941, Wayne had established himself as a reliable star, not yet among Hollywood's absolute elite, but definitely ascending. Stagecoach's success had secured his place. He was getting better roles, building a fan base, making solid money. Then, December 7th, 1941, happened. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and America joined World War II. The country's entry into the war triggered the greatest collective outpouring of patriotism in American history, a national unity that's hard to imagine today. It seemed that everyone wanted to contribute, to sacrifice, to be part of the historic effort. Women rushed to factories, taking jobs traditionally held by men, building tanks and planes and ships. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She represented millions of real women who kept American industry running. Men of fighting age rushed into military service. Enlistment stations had lines around the block. Many famous public figures enlisted immediately, some who were significantly older than Wayne. Clark Gable was in his 40s when he enlisted. Jimmy Stewart was underweight and initially rejected, but fought his way in. Both would risk their lives in actual combat over Europe. Directors like John Ford and Frank Capra made documentaries for the war effort, often in dangerous conditions. Even older stars like James Cagney threw themselves into war bond tours and morale-building appearances. John Wayne pulled strings to stay out of it all. He was in his early 30s, prime fighting age, exactly the demographic the military needed most. Wayne claimed later that his family situation made service impossible. He had 4 children and was engaged in a divorce. But plenty of men with children served. Plenty of men with complicated family situations served. The truth, documented in letters and studio correspondence, is that Wayne asked for and received deferments. He did USO tours, yes, traveling overseas to entertain troops, standing on safe stages far from combat, telling jokes and shaking hands. But even those tours had an ulterior motive beyond patriotism. As Wayne himself admitted during the war, in a moment of unusual honesty, "I better go do some touring. I feel the draft breathing down my neck." The USO appearances were calculated to maintain his public image while avoiding actual service. They were insurance, visible proof that he was doing something for the war effort. When Wayne visited a military hospital in Hawaii to entertain wounded troops, men who'd actually seen combat, who'd been shot and burned and blasted fighting America's enemies, something happened that Wayne never fully got over. The Marines booed him. They booed him off the stage. These weren't pacifists or conscientious objectors. These were actual warriors who'd earned the right to wear the uniform. And they saw right through Wayne's tough guy act. They saw the fake machismo, the borrowed courage he performed in movies but wouldn't demonstrate in reality. They resented deeply that he'd ducked service, had pulled strings to stay safe in Hollywood while they'd actually fought and bled and watched their friends die. Wayne never got over that humiliation. Never. It haunted him for the remaining 38 years of his life. He developed a deep corrosive guilt complex that fundamentally shaped his public image, his career choices, his politics, everything about how he presented himself to the world. The humiliation of being called booed by actual warriors became the defining wound of his life, the thing he spent decades trying to heal through performance and public posturing. It explained his decision to star in numerous, almost compulsive war movies throughout the rest of his career: Flying Leathernecks, The Sands of Iwo Jima, The Fighting Seabees, The Green Berets, Back to Bataan. They were expendable, movie after movie where Wayne played soldiers, Marines, tough guys who risked everything for their country. He was playing on screen the kind of man he wished he'd been in reality, living out fantasies of heroism and sacrifice he'd been too cautious or calculated to actually pursue. Every war film was an apology, an attempt to retroactively earn the credibility he'd forfeited when he stayed home. 4 years after being booed by wounded Marines, 4 years he spent thinking about that humiliation every single day, Wayne played Sergeant Stryker, a grizzled combat Marine in the sands of Iwo Jima. He threw himself into the role with unusual intensity, determined to get every detail right, to prove he could at least embody military masculinity convincingly, even if he'd never lived it. He nailed the performance. The film was a massive hit. Wayne earned a Best Actor Oscar nomination, the Academy's seal of approval. Audiences who'd never served believed completely in his portrayal, but the real Marines who'd actually fought at Iwo Jima, they knew the difference between performance and reality, as Wayne's third wife later explained with unusual psychological insight. He would become a super patriot for the rest of his life, trying to atone for staying at home. That's exactly what happened. Wayne became more aggressively patriotic than veterans, more hawkish than generals, more committed to proving his toughness than men who'd actually demonstrated courage under fire. He became a cheerleader for the Vietnam War, even as public opinion turned against it, visiting troops, making the Green Berets as explicit propaganda when other stars were questioning American involvement. His politics hardened into rigid conservatism, as if left-wing politics represented the softness and cowardice he feared in himself. Everything was overcompensation, performance, an endless attempt to become the image he'd failed to live up to when it actually mattered. The contrast with other Hollywood stars who actually served makes Wayne's story even more striking. Clark Gable was MGM's biggest star and greatest box office draw when America entered the war. He could have easily stayed home. Instead, after his wife died in an air crash during a war bonds tour, Gable enlisted in the Army Air Forces. He wanted to become an aerial gunner. Instead, he was sent to officer candidate school and commissioned as a second lieutenant in October 1942. Then, on personal orders from General Hap Arnold, he was sent to England with the 8th Air Force to make a combat recruitment film for aerial gunners. But Gable needed combat footage. To get it, he flew 5 actual combat missions as a waist gunner in B-17 flying fortresses, including bombing raids into Germany. His presence was for propaganda purposes, sure, but the dangers were completely real. In one mission, Gable's B-17 was attacked by enemy fighters and hit by anti-aircraft fire. The plane lost an engine and had its stabilizer damaged. Over Germany, his aircraft was struck by flak that wounded 2 crewmen and killed another. Shrapnel went through Gable's boot and nearly took off his head. When MGM heard about their most valuable asset's brushes with death, they worked their connections to have him reassigned to non-combat duty. For his service, Gable was awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross and an Air Medal. He was ordered home in late 1943 to edit his recruitment film. He hoped for another combat assignment, but none came. By summer 1944, after the Normandy invasion came and went without orders, Gable finally requested to be relieved from active duty. He was 43 by then, over age for combat. He stayed in the Air Force Reserves until 1947, when he resigned his commission. Then, there was Jimmy Stewart, whose story we started with. Stewart's grandfather had fought in the Civil War. His father had fought in the Spanish-American War and World War I. When World War II came, service was simply what you did. But Stewart was drafted in 1940 and medically rejected for being underweight. He didn't accept that. Stewart was a flight enthusiast who'd secured his pilot certificate in 1935. By the time war broke out, he'd logged over 400 hours in the air. He used that experience to enlist in the Army Air Forces in 1941, despite still being underweight. After graduating from pilot training in 1942, Stewart was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Higher-ups wanted to use his celebrity for PR, bond drives, rally appearances, safe assignments. Stewart refused. He wanted combat. After considerable effort and clashes with commanders, he managed a transfer to a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber group that joined the 8th Air Force in Britain in autumn 1943. On December 13, 1943, Stewart flew his first combat mission, piloting the lead B-24 of his group's high squadron as they bombed Kiel. Days later, he led the entire group's formation to Bremen. By February 1944, Stewart had been promoted to major and awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross. The following month, he led an entire bomb wing in a raid on Berlin. By late March, he was assigned as operations officer for a newly formed bomb group. The position meant Stewart wasn't required to fly combat missions, but he wanted to inspire his new unit, so he personally piloted the lead B-24 on numerous raids deep into Nazi Germany. He also served as a crewman on other missions. His actions earned him a second Distinguished Flying Cross, a French Croix de Guerre, an air medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and other decorations. After the war, Stewart returned to Hollywood, but continued serving in the Air Force Reserves. He kept current with new bombers, B-36 Peacemakers, B-47 Stratojets, B-52 Stratofortresses. He was promoted to colonel in 1953 and given reserve command of Dobbins Air Force Base in Georgia. By 1959, Stewart had reached brigadier general. He continued serving until he retired in 1968. Think about that progression. From Hollywood star to combat bomber pilot to general certified to fly nuclear-armed strategic bombers, Stewart didn't just play heroes. He was one. The gap between Wayne's manufactured toughness and Stewart's authentic heroism reveals something essential about the Golden Age. The studio system could create an image, could teach someone to walk differently, to talk differently, could craft an entire public persona. But it couldn't create character. That had to come from somewhere else. And when the difference between image and reality became too stark, the results could be tragic. Nobody understood that better than Roscoe Conkling Arbuckle, known to millions as Fatty Arbuckle. Fatty was a silent film-era superstar, a comedian who weighed about 300 pounds and incorporated his mass into his comedy. He moved gracefully, tumbled, threw pies, played the lovable jolly fat guy. But Arbuckle wasn't just an actor. He was a Hollywood power player who mentored Charlie Chaplin, discovered Buster Keaton, launched Bob Hope's career. Then came September 1921. Arbuckle and friends rented adjacent luxury suites at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco for what was supposed to be a weekend of celebration. Several women were invited to join the party. Prohibition was in effect, but that rarely stopped Hollywood types who had the money and connections to get whatever they wanted. Bootleg alcohol flowed freely. Music played, people danced, and at some point during the revelry, somewhere in the chaos of multiple rooms and multiple parties happening simultaneously, an aspiring actress named Virginia Ropp was found seriously ill in one of the suites, lying on a bed, moaning in pain. The hotel doctor was summoned. He examined Rapp quickly, concluded she was just extremely drunk, a common enough occurrence at Hollywood parties, and gave her morphine to calm her and help her sleep it off. He should have looked closer, should have done a more thorough examination, should have recognized the signs of serious internal injury. Instead, he left her to sleep. 2 days later, Rapp's condition had deteriorated dramatically. She was rushed to a hospital, fevered and in agony. There, a friend of Rapp's named Maud Delmont suddenly claimed that Fatty Arbuckle had raped Rapp at the party. The next day, September 9th, 1921, Virginia Rapp died of peritonitis caused by a ruptured bladder. She was 26 years old. Medical examinations of her body found no physical evidence of rape. No tears, no bruising consistent with sexual assault, nothing that would indicate violent penetration. But newspapers, especially William Randolph Hearst's newspapers, which never let facts interfere with a good story, had a field day. Headlines screamed scandal. Stories grew increasingly salacious with each edition, each paper trying to outdo the others in sensationalism. Some alleged that Arbuckle, who weighed 300 pounds, had killed Rapp with his weight while he assaulted her, literally crushing her to death. Other stories claimed he'd penetrated her with a piece of ice, a bizarre detail that seemed designed purely for shock value. Those stories eventually morphed into even more lurid accusations, that he'd ruptured her insides with a bottle of Coca-Cola or champagne, using the bottle as a weapon in some kind of perverted assault. Police investigators, under enormous pressure from both the media and ambitious politicians, theorized that Arbuckle's massive weight atop Rappa during intercourse, consensual or otherwise, had ruptured her bladder. Arbuckle denied everything, maintained his innocence, insisted that nothing inappropriate had happened. But he was arrested anyway and charged with multiple felonies, including manslaughter and rape. The scandal generated massive, unprecedented media attention. This was decades before television, but newspapers provided wall-to-wall coverage that rivaled anything you'd see today. The trial became a national obsession, covered by hundreds of journalists from across the country and around the world. Arbuckle was regarded by those who actually knew him as good-natured, shy around women, almost painfully polite. The most chaste man in pictures, some people described him. Charlie Chaplin, who'd known Arbuckle for years and counted him as a close friend, later wrote, "I knew Roscoe as a genial and easygoing man who would not harm a fly." Other friends and colleagues testified to his gentle character, his professionalism, his complete lack of violent or aggressive tendencies. But newspapers and prosecutors weren't interested in the real Roscoe Arbuckle. They created and promoted a very different image, depicting him as a gross pervert, a sexual predator who routinely used his massive bulk to overpower and have his way with innocent girls. The contrast between his lovable on-screen persona and this manufactured image of depravity made the scandal even more salacious. How could Jolly Fatty, the man who made children laugh, be capable of such monstrous acts? The cognitive dissonance itself became part of the story. The prosecution's case eventually fell apart under scrutiny, but not before Arbuckle had been dragged through months of legal hell and public humiliation. It turned out that San Francisco's district attorney, Matthew Brady, was an ambitious man with plans to run for California governor. He saw the Arbuckle case as his ticket to statewide fame and had pressured witnesses into lying, into inventing details, into changing their stories to support his theory of events. The defense team obtained a letter, actual written evidence, from the state's star witness, Maud Delmont, Virginia Rapp's friend, who'd first leveled the accusations of assault. In that letter, Delmont admitted that she had planned to extort money from Arbuckle, that the accusations were never about justice, but about a payday. During the actual trial, the prosecution produced little credible evidence, despite months of investigation. Medical experts brought in by the defense demonstrated conclusively that Rapp's bladder had been ruptured by an internal inflammation, likely chronic cystitis, that had been developing for weeks or months, not by any external force applied during the party. The jury in the first trial deadlocked 10-2 in favor of acquittal. A mistrial was declared. Brady, refusing to accept defeat despite his case's obvious weakness, pushed for a second trial. That jury again deadlocked 10-2 in favor of a not guilty verdict. Most prosecutors would have given up. Brady pushed for a third trial, determined to get some kind of conviction, his political ambitions too invested to let it go. At the conclusion of the third trial, after all of the evidence had been presented yet again, after witnesses had been cross-examined for the third time, the jury took just 6 minutes of deliberation to return a unanimous verdict of not guilty. 6 minutes. They'd heard enough. They knew Arbuckle was innocent. The jury even took the unusual step of issuing a written apology to Arbuckle, stating, "Acquittal is not enough for Roscoe Arbuckle. We wish him success and hope that the American people will take the judgment of 14 men and women that Roscoe Arbuckle is entirely innocent and free from all blame." But Roscoe Arbuckle was exonerated in the courts only. His reputation never recovered from the months of lurid headlines and public accusations. His public image was destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. His career was finished. The studio system had created Fatty Arbuckle, the lovable comedian, had built him into a star worth millions. The newspapers and public opinion had destroyed Roscoe Arbuckle, the human being, in a matter of weeks, and there was nothing the studios could do to put that manufactured image back together. Some cracks are too deep to repair. Some accusations, once made publicly, can never be fully taken back regardless of verdicts. Rudolph Valentino faced a different kind of image problem, though it emerged only after his death. Valentino was the Latin lover, the silent film era's ultimate sex symbol and a 1920s masculine ideal. He shot to fame with performances in The Sheik and The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. When he died suddenly at age 31, his female fans erupted in mass hysteria. His early death at the height of popularity solidified his iconic status. But before Hollywood stardom, Valentino had worked as a dancer in taxi dance clubs. These establishments were basically escort services. Clients would examine the club's stable of dancers and pay to dance with whoever caught their eye. If the client liked their dance partner, they'd negotiate a price, pay the club an exit fee, and leave together. Some taxi dance clubs were legitimate, most weren't. Valentino was once arrested in a brothel before he became famous. It's unlikely his taxi dance club was the innocent kind. Imagine if that information about Brad Pitt emerged today. The media firestorm would be unprecedented. But in Valentino's era, the revelation came after death, when there was no career left to destroy. The studios had successfully protected his image while it mattered. After he was gone, the truth could emerge without consequences to the system that had created him. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Hollywood's golden age. This channel is all about peeling back the layers on stories we think we know and revealing the fascinating truth underneath. We publish new episodes every single day, covering everything from forgotten inventors to political scandals to cultural revolutions. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. But here's my final question for you. Knowing what you now know about the gap between Hollywood's manufactured images and these stars' real lives, which story surprised you most? The war heroes who actually fought? The scandals that destroyed careers? The studio system's iron grip on performers' identities? Or the tragic gap between someone like John Wayne's image and his private shame? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The star system began to crumble in the late 1940s after the United States Supreme Court ruled against studios in a landmark antitrust case, United States v. Paramount Pictures. The court found that studios had created an illegal monopoly by owning both production and distribution, controlling everything from how films were made to which theaters showed them. The studios were forced to divest, to break up their vertical integration. That legal decision alone would have been enough to shake the system, but it coincided with another massive disruption. Television's arrival reduced movie audiences dramatically almost overnight. Families who used to go to theaters 2 or 3 times a week could now stay home and watch entertainment for free. Theater attendance plummeted. Suddenly, contracted stars under long-term deals, stars who had to be paid whether they worked or not, whether their films made money or not, transformed from assets into expensive overhead. The economics no longer made sense. From the 40s through the 60s, studios gradually, sometimes reluctantly, abandoned the long-term contract system that had defined Hollywood for decades. They stopped manufacturing stars through years-long apprenticeships. They stopped controlling every aspect of performers' lives. Hollywood performers became freelancers, independent contractors, part of a large pool of talent from which studios could draw as needed for specific projects. The age of manufactured stars, of complete totalizing control over performers' lives, names, backgrounds, and identities, came to an end. Not because studios suddenly developed ethics or compassion, but because the business model no longer worked. But the legacy of that system remains embedded in Hollywood's DNA even today. Today's celebrities still navigate the treacherous gap between public image and private reality, still manage the performance of being famous. Social media has made that gap even more treacherous in some ways, even more performative. The difference, and it's a crucial difference, is that modern performers have significantly more control, more agency, more ability to push back against studios and publicists and handlers. They can fire their teams. They can speak directly to fans without studio-approved messaging. They can have scandals and comebacks, can be messy and complicated in public. The studio system's collapse meant that stars could be complicated human beings publicly instead of having to maintain impossible standards of perfection 24 hours a day. They could have political opinions that differed from studio bosses. They could get divorced without being shelved. They could advocate for causes, could be activists, could define themselves rather than being entirely defined by corporate masters who owned their names and faces. The change wasn't complete. Studios still wield enormous power. Publicists still shape narratives. Image still matters tremendously. But performers are no longer property in the way they were during Hollywood's golden age. Hollywood's golden age created the most glamorous, influential era in film history. The movies produced during those decades remain artistic masterpieces that defined cinema as an art form. It also created a system of control and manipulation that psychologically damaged many of the people it elevated to stardom, that treated human beings as manufactured products to be marketed and controlled and discarded when they were no longer profitable. Some stars, like Jimmy Stewart and Clark Gable, transcended the system through authentic action that needed no enhancement from studio publicity departments, through genuine heroism that couldn't be manufactured or performed. Others, like John Wayne, spent their entire lives trying to become the manufactured image, using career choices and political posturing to paper over private regret and shame. And some, like Fatty Arbuckle and Lana Turner, were chewed up and spat out when their human complexity inevitably collided with the perfect image studios had sold to the public. The mansions remain as physical monuments to that era. You can still visit some of them today, can still walk through estates where presidents and kings and Nobel Prize winners once mingled with movie stars, where the beautiful people played at being American royalty. Pickfair was eventually demolished in the 1990s. Torn down to make way for a new mansion, the memory of Pickford and Fairbanks literally reduced to rubble. But Falcon Lair still stands in Benedict Canyon, Valentino's Italian fantasy preserved as a historical landmark. These places are monuments to an era when Hollywood believed it could manufacture not just movies, but perfect human beings, when studios thought they could create and control every aspect of human identity. The movies from that era endure as masterpieces that still move audiences, still demonstrate the power of cinema at its finest. But the real story, the one we've explored today, is what happened to the people inside those mansions, behind those studio gates, beneath those carefully crafted public images that required constant maintenance and performance. That story is messier than the official histories, darker than the nostalgic retrospectives, more heroic in unexpected ways, and infinitely more human than anything Hollywood's golden age ever put on screen. Because the manufactured perfection was always a lie, and the truth, as we've seen, was far more interesting,